job was to begin to trace what happened after the eviction, and I used this eviction trajectory as an entry way to begin to find the displaced housing geographies that I was speaking about. So I don't know where people are creating forms of housing. I have hunches and ideas through this diagram, but maybe if I follow this group of people after they have been evicted and see where they were taken to and also where they chose to go, I can define other displaced housing geographies that I was looking for and try to find the alliances behind them. So it was a mess, clearly, from the, from the diagram. Some groups were immediately taken to temporary shelters in gyms and in hotels in Brussels and in Flanders. And then others, a large group was pushed back into homelessness, and there was a huge tent camp that was set in front of Le Petit Chateau, which is a reception center from the federal government, right? And so they occupied the bridge for some time, and then they were evicted from there again. And so some of them moved to Aledukai, which is a sociocultural space that was shutting down, and they offered, maybe you can just stay here for a while, right? And they were evicted from there again, and then there was a large group that created a political squad, like a clearly, we are squatting this building until you give us housing sort of arrangement. Some of them were housed by Phyllis and around 70 asylum seekers out of But from this occupation, another squad started actually across, just next to the headquarters of the political party of the Minister of Asylum and Migration at the time. And then they had, her name is Nicole Dimore, and then they had this big sign that says, "Toc toc Nicole, like we came to you." And so it was a very confrontational form of squatting. All of these dotted lines are traces that maybe I wasn't able to trace myself, but my hunch is like if from 1,070 are housed by Philistine at the end, probably a lot of people moved to other squads, some people maybe went to hosting networks in private homes, maybe some people went into the private rental market and were able to find something there. And so I will only speak about these three geographies very briefly, which are squatting in Palais de Droit and in the National Crisis Center, the first political squad I spoke about, in homelessness as a site for displaced housing, even though it's homelessness, but there are infrastructures that support it that are important to read, and the infrastructures of hospitality. The idea, especially in recognizing homelessness as a part of something meaningful, as a part of a housing practice, which might be contradictory at face value, is what Lencioni and Simone describe as there are ways of being in the urban, of performing in between of spaces that are taken away and of bodies and existences that are marked as foreclosed. So there are geographies that emerge where displaced people and their way of creating housing, however precarious, however fleeting, however transient, is a method of being in the urban. Because so many people share the experiences of homelessness, I am inclined to take it seriously, or to take desperation seriously, as Lencioni implies, and to look at how do people facilitate an existence with their homelessness. So maybe I'll only speak about that one. Oh, it's not here. My God. Okay, so maybe I'll just touch on the infrastructures of in-hospitality instead, which I mentioned that there was this sociocultural organization that allowed people to spend a few nights within it. It's called Aledukai, and it's along this the canal in Brussels, where there's huge canal redevelopment processes happening. And so as part of that, they allow sometimes sociocultural organizations to temporarily occupy spaces, to activate them, to make them more lively until the actual renovation happens for certain spaces. And so Two-Stand created Alay Dukai within that framework, and they had this space. And they allowed people people ended up there, let's say. But then they were evicted, as you can see in the eviction pictures. Like they were like together with like the police coming together to get people out of the building. They drilled holes in the building to make it completely uninhabitable from that point on, so people cannot come back. And I think it's important to note that like a week before, or maybe 2 weeks before, there was like a 2,000 person party, and this is an image from that party in the same building. But suddenly, it was already planned to be redeveloped, but suddenly it became like urgent, critical, that we have to make this building uninhabitable, and we're going to drill holes so that people cannot inhabit it, when racialized displaced people were existing in it, which is an important dynamic. And I think how that blends into urban processes of regeneration and redevelopment of a canal plan is also an important dynamic in this, because what is the future that is envisioned for that type of space, and for the people who are envisioned to be a part of it or not, is important. And this temporary use rhythm also happens for like, and this idea of like real estate prospecting and trying to find spaces to do things also happens for pedestrian and other groups. Please feel free to tell me what you take away, or tell me what you think of after this presentation. But what I've been trying to do through this research and through like trying to coin the term displaced housing as a category of housing produced by displaced people within and without citizenship, and looking at displaced housing geographies and alliances within a broader urban ecosystem as a way of reading these practices and taking them seriously as a form of spatial practice knowledge and as a site for intervention. To do so, I try to argue that moving beyond the binaries of migrant, non-migrant, and formal, informal allows us to look at an ecosystem of displaced housing in the urban context, where we frame displacement as a socio-economic possession that both citizens and non-citizens experience. And then the displaced housing practices with beyond this boundary are making propositions. They are propositional politics beyond the nation state and citizenship. And finally, that informality as a lens to analyze even the formal housing system is important, and to further blur the distinctions between the two, and to highlight the interdependencies between the different geographies in this broader ecosystem. And so I will leave you with a quote from Darling, where he speaks about how a focus on informality in urban space suggests that the city becomes a space of politics of critique to the state, and how it's a form of politics that rejects and challenges forms of governmentality, and so it's like the objection of the displaced people. It's the objection that they make spatially through their urban space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tasneem, for this always fascinating lectures, and if it's any consolation, in 3 weeks' time, it seems like you have your, your PhD underway. Inshallah. But Tasneem's obviously given us a lot to think about from the first half of the presentation, where she talks about the externalization and internalization of border practices. And the questions that came along with that. I think the one that stood out to me was this question about, let's see, Like, where does the coercion begin, and who is coerced? And perhaps as people, or as a student population that comes from many, many places around the world, perhaps these notions, I know Tasneem's asked you to, yes, to give feedback and questions on the work that she's done, but perhaps it's also a way of thinking about your own context and perhaps your own researches and if you've been seeing similar conditions. And then in the second half of the presentation, where it really like brings it back to kind of displacement and then within the context of the city itself. And I think for me the part that stands out when you, in both cases, were saying that through these practices of different routes in which people are trying to make a home, it's this question about, well, when a home isn't given to me, what other options do I have, or how am I making a home for myself in the city? And I think this fantastic question about how do people facilitate an existence within homelessness. So there's a lot of food for thought there, and I hope it'll spark good discussion. You had your hand up already? Great.
Hi, was a lot of presentation. I actually have a question, more like a comment question. I think this is quite an interesting piece of research, and I attended the PhD defense of Dr. Mila Kaskar, and I think there's quite an interesting way where she looked at the soft architecture created by migrant communities. And I was wondering if you also looked at the manifestations of informality, and was the architecture of that as well in a similar way, like the softness of the construction of these places?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm still sad that I couldn't make it to that defense. I mean, it's fantastic. She's really incredible. Yes and no. I don't really employ very much a spatial analysis of this notion of like soft architecture versus hard. Actually, my PhD project is two trajectories, one connected to spatial practice and one connected to governance and housing governance. I'm more on the governance side. But my colleague Ian Verheyden, and we did a lot of the field work together in all of these contexts, where we worked quite a bit with this organization in Brussels called Global Roma, which is an arts organization for what they call newcomers, so anyone regardless of legal status, and they help people facilitate. And in there, because we did a participatory action research, there's this collective called Espace Femme, and they directly tackle this notion of soft architecture. How do you make this space more inhabitable? So these negotiations within the space itself. You can anticipate Henry Braden's research coming soon, but I don't give it as much space, unfortunately, though I find it fascinating.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. So my question is about the housing system here in Belgium, because it seems that it immediately positions any external boundary into displacement, and that is regardless of an immigrant or formal, informal. I dealt with it, the system is too complex to navigate. And for example, for us as students, we came under the protection of the university, we were housed by the university. And now if we want to navigate our after study years here, again, we're into displacement. So is this system this complicated in relation to, like, has it been more complicated, or what's the word? Yeah, because of the housing crisis, the immigration crisis in 2015, or was it always this complex? Because I hear that it has, like, rules have grown to be more complex with time.
Yes.
Recently.
Okay, so the housing system in Belgium, in very particular, in the sense that broadly, a lot of people, especially Belgian citizens, own their housing, right? And so it's framed as a nation that's asset rich but income poor for older people. And so a lot of older people, their main investment is to buy a house, and then they that's their asset for their retirement, etc. Right? Not necessarily like a robust pension and stuff. Right? And so this creates a condition where, unlike other European contexts, a lot of landlords are actually small owners rather than massive financialized housing structures. The trick is the housing system is very discriminatory because there are no legal remedies. There are suggestions, there are recommendations, but there are no legal remedies to specific forms of discrimination. I tried to rent an apartment once, and a friend who speaks French called the landlord on my behalf, and the first question the landlord asked was, "What's the last name of this person who's trying to rent?" And then the minute they gave them the last name, they were like, "Oh no, sorry," and then they hung up, right? And then my friend wanted to complain about it, but it was a dead end somehow, you know. And so landlords also can tell real estate agents, for example, that I don't want X, Y, and Z, and then like you deal with it, and there's no real like pushback against that. So that's one dimension that has to do with like discrimination, and but there's also the other dimension that like of increased housing precarity in general. I wouldn't connect it necessarily to migration, but perhaps we can all feel an increase in rent over the last few years, for example. We can all feel how difficult it is to find a place. But and I would link it to like broader processes, like a city like Leuven. The housing market is very significant in it because there's this constant influx of people who are coming in and out all the time. And there's a lot of ways to make profit off of that. And so you immediately cancel anyone with low income, anyone with like a certain kind of citizenship. I mean, you know, and they always create this hierarchy that as if that sometimes argue to like we want the safest person possible to get the house. And so it's probably like a blend of all of these processes, like a neoliberal housing market with practices of discrimination, and a lot of this discrimination is not just towards undocumented migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, also around migrants. People, what form of residency do you have? How long term it is? How it also impacts income. What kind of job do you have? How much income do you make? So it's along all of these lines together at the same time. And sometimes, unfortunately,
maybe to just on that point, and because there is, with the way that the politics of Belgium, but also the politics of Europe in general, the way that it's moving, that there is discourse around how a lot of these like laws, in this case we talk about housing, but this can apply to many things, about how these rules did exist, but they were felt by particular people within society and others were immune to them, and now more people are feeling them. And so I guess my question is, just as a continuation of this, is do you find that to also be true with your research?
You mean the precarity?
Is that, like you're saying, like the people that are now considered to be safe to rent to, that pool seems to be decreasing because the
No, it's just, it creates competition. It's like, it's not about how small the pool is, right? It's like a lottery to apply for an apartment, and so you have this pool of applications, and a lot of times it is justified and not challenged enough for a landlord to be like, high salary, longest residence, you know, like that, and then all of these people become excluded by default from the private rental market because so many landlords are making that choice, right? And so you end up viewing, even as a citizen, sometimes as a racialized citizen, you will face the same discrimination because of your last name. I read a study where there was the highest levels of discrimination were against single mothers and like single men of Turkish and Moroccan origin, for example. And so there is also a form of, you know, a lack of protection, let's say. And when social housing is so limited, and long waiting lines, then where do people go? Is a very good question to ask when there is this massive vacancy in a city like Brussels. Sometimes it's joked to be like the 21st commune of Brussels, like how much empty space there is. But I think this is something that's like integrated into these processes of neoliberal urbanism and also racialized exclusions of people that meet together in this moment where you're viewing the 20th apartment 3-story happened to me. Still no one is like responding to you, right? And I have a form of legalized residency and I have a form of income. So I can only imagine what these processes are like, or I can imagine that there are alternative circuits that try to facilitate housing on the rental market. That are not this because you already know that you're excluded from it. And so I think that's the thing I'm most interested in. Okay, this is the system, what do people do? Because people do something. And so where can I find it? How can I locate it? Where are the rules there? How did these people come together? How did this setup come to exist?
Well, do you think also that asylum seeking is also an alternative circle to this? Because if maybe the housing market, the working market were more tolerable with externals, people would not be forced to always seek asylum. Sometimes the two systems are connected because I feel like people are mostly pushed by the system to seek migration. Because there is no other way in.
You mean into the city?
Into the continent in general.
Yeah, but oftentimes you can't apply for asylum until you're on the continent, right? Except for like very small scale resettlement plans.
Yeah.
And so,
I mean, even with that, with you like doing all the research, doing all the work, and trying to be within the legal margin of being accepted into the work system or the housing system, you're not accepted, so you can are forced to seek other options.
yeah. I mean, to be honest, I personally relate to that notion because I am an asylum seeker in Belgium, you know? And a huge part of that decision was the fact that I do not, I mean, my country is at war, but also I do not know what will happen with my residency status if I just rely on finding the next job and the next job and trying to hang in for 5 years. At some point, I might be deported to a war zone. So that was part of the thinking process, indeed. But it doesn't necessarily. Yeah, I mean, I think people are smart and are able to use even the systems that oppress them as a way to navigate their lived realities. And so I don't think that's unheard of. A case like that.
Hello. Thank you very much for that presentation. I was very interested, especially when you were mentioning the colonial histories and all the structures that did create in the long run impoverishment and displacement. And also when you mentioned the dynamic nature of borders and stated that borders often start even in the origin countries. Which I would say is also my case. I'm from Mozambique, and there is, for example, no embassy in Mozambique, so I have to travel to ask for a visa. But with that being said, I also understand that it is important to a certain extent to not also over-romanticize the idea of I would say mass migration in the sense that the receiving country also has limited resources to a certain extent. I understand the source of these resources, but where I'm going with this is it possible to have this conversation without looking at the notion of reparations?
Right.
Thank you.
So, is it possible to have this conversation without the notion of reparations? It's a very good question. Actually, I was just writing this part, so I'm looking at my laptop. And so, I think that is the argumentation that's being made in the mainstream media, discourses, which seems in its more docile forms reasonable, right? How can we afford to accept and quote unquote integrate all of these groups into this national context? And I think there are a few counter arguments made even within this like neoliberal logic of like my contributions are being spent to support people who did not necessarily contribute to welfare, to social. How does that mean? And that I found this report by the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that found that actually migrants contribute more in taxes and social contributions than they receive in benefits across the member states that they were in. There are also the arguments about migrants and displaced peoples in particular contributions to their labor and how that really facilitates huge parts of the economy that would collapse without it, particularly agriculture, which is like the food for the cities that it exists. There are also arguments that are connected to a broader critique of welfare nationalism. Let me find it. Because it assumes that there's this magnet dimension. So if we have better welfare, if we treat displaced people well, it will be a magnet, and then all the other displaced people are going to come to us, and then we will unfairly carry the burden compared to other countries. And that also was debunked by empirical studies that say that actually the main driver for people to choose the places where they settle is the availability of work, which is like a direct opposite of that. And B, this magnet theory overestimates how much displaced people know about welfare systems. Like it's not like displaced people are sitting and being like, okay, if I pay this much tax and this much benefit will come to me better, and they actually have better benefits. And that deep level, citizens don't understand welfare systems to that depth. And so it's also debunked that people make their choices based on solely or like as the main factor of this pull rhetoric. But I think beyond these framings, I still think it's important to speak about historical responsibilities and current implications, like when imperialism is a living thing that we live through right now, and you are supporting dictatorships elsewhere, or you are supporting funding wars elsewhere, or you're sending weapons to X, Y, and Z, that I think it does everyone a disservice to start the story from second rather than first, right? So first, this thing happened, and then, so at some point, this accountability is necessary. Because if you don't want that, then stop doing this. Then maybe we will be prosperous in our own home countries and we don't want to come here anyway, right? And so it's this. I think reiterating that is very important. We can't exclude it from the conversation.
And to that, it's also this comparative study with Ukraine, I think it's very, very conceived, very underestimated. The speed with which the city, independently of the federal government, the speed that the city set up infrastructure, not only for the first reception for the Ukrainians, but also for the so-called integration, is admirable.
Yeah.
Like the knowledge and the means and the resources are there. The infrastructure, while still standing, empty right now. And then we were also, as Brussels, we were expecting 80,000 people and 20,000 came. So these 6,000 places are somewhere. The money for these 6,000 places are also somewhere, the work, positions, everything. So, and it ties again to what you were saying about who's deserving.
If there's one thing I wish I had the time to do, and I definitely will not do the next 3 weeks, is to really compare how the responses for Ukrainian refugees has debunked key arguments that were made by the same governments and politicians before about what is possible and what is not. Like, there's no money, there's no, and it's not to say that Ukrainians don't deserve to be led escaping a war zone, but it highlights these hypocrisies and it highlights what is possible in practice as being done by the same governments that said otherwise.
And also the contradictions that the city has in itself, like the guy that was responsible for the response for the Ukrainian crisis said, I will do it only if we universalize the whole shit.
Yeah.
Like, then other migrants get the same exactly responses. And then he was out of his position and he was put in somewhere else.
Yeah, but this is also the tension between federal and local governments that highlights this. And I think in the case of Pellegrino One, it's very concrete. Like, there is money to buy this building, transform it to refugee accommodation, but not these refugees who were there before. So it really makes it solid how this mismatch.
And I think then again in this part, because someone mentioned competition, and it's not in this competition in the private market about housing and buildings, but it's also transfers and reflects a lot again on the asylum systems. That then different actors, like the ones that act for Ukrainians and Fedazil or other people that act for other things, they compete about the same buildings, and then the prices are getting higher, and then they're all just swimming around.
Any other questions or comments or similarities you can draw from your own context? We still have time, so we're going to stay here. But maybe then, as you think of super interesting questions or comments, I don't know if you have questions in the audience, or if you would like to perhaps show us one of the two examples, like Athens or Berlin, that could maybe spark another conversation, because I guess they're also cities you're visited or that you come from.
Okay, I see two people nodding and a few people here. So, but I think I can do it more loosely than like,
we can have a conversational argument.
Yeah. So, comparing three cities is fascinating because you suddenly, you see different practices happening and you see similar practices happening, and both are exciting to witness. Because I chose Athens, Brussels, and Berlin because I wanted to see how the border works at like a hotspot country, as it's called in EU policy. So it's a country on the border. It's mostly Greece and Italy, where a high number of refugees arrive, and it's like the contestation is very bad. And then I chose Brussels because Belgium is sometimes spoken about as a transit country where people move through Belgium to go to the UK or to somewhere else. And then Berlin, in the German context, it's like thought of as a country of arrival where people want to go to Germany, because in 2015, I believe they suspended the Dublin Protocol for Syrian refugees, and so more people felt like they could go there. And so that was like a rough training that I do. Of course, when I looked into it a bit more, I was like, that's not a good training because it assumes like a linear trajectory of movement, and that people don't like circulate actually in between spaces or whatever. But that's the general training. And so I don't have to do this. Okay. And so Athens was great because it's the first urban context of arrival for a lot of migrants coming into Europe. But it showcases this. Oh, here. Please add anything at any point. That's your city. And so it highlights the tension between hospitality on the one hand, touristification, and border management. Because imagine this, like the Greek islands, tourist destinations. A lot of people go on holiday, people are staying by the water, whatever. But also the zone where a lot of people crossing the Mediterranean arrive into. So it's like, it's in the same space, this notion of like tourism, which is a major driver of the Greek economy, and also the arrival of displaced people into the city. And so in the context of Athens, it is highlighted as this like struggle against touristification of the city, where a lot of apartments are now Airbnb, they remain empty until a tourist comes, whereas like maybe local communities cannot find housing. And so it became a contested space where all of these forces are happening at the same time. And so when we went there, and then we arrived when the last urban camp in Athens was being evicted. So a lot of the camps are on the islands, and then in the city there aren't many camp spaces. And so you stay on the camp until you are accepted or rejected, and then you are allowed into the city or you're sent somewhere else, right? So there was one urban camp left, it was called Eleonals, and people really were fighting so it doesn't get evicted. And that is because so many people who were in Camp Eleonals had the possibility to go into the city sometimes, to work, to make some money, to engage with communities of support and care, to engage with the city, rather than, even though it's like really at the edge of the city, but they had the possibility to go, which a lot of people in Camp Beyond were not. It's essentially like a carceral institution, Beyond. And it was ejected because they wanted to build a stadium in its place. Or it's a part of this regeneration process where the mayor at the time was like, oh, we're going to correct all the mistakes we made in Athens over the past years. We're going to build a small complex, we're going to have a stadium, more tourists will come, and we're going to be able to transform the city in this way. And while on the ground, like the camp was getting evicted because of that.
Just to frame that in the whole like history, what you said that they found beautiful, but this history of struggles or past negotiations, Leonas, it means olive grove, and it's really on the edge of the city, and it's completely, it was, at some point, it was the center of agriculture, and it provided food, but for some years now, it's completely, it has a lot of Roman settlements, and it's neglected, there is nothing, actually. And it started because if you saw like the map of Athens with all the recent developments that are happening across the metropolitan region, it's a very strategic plan on where they plant these new developments and what they evict for this new development. It's an honest, it's a city center, it's the former airport. So they're being very smart, very strategic on eroding the history of the city, and then you will have the Basilica. So they're
I mean, it's clear this notion of like cleaning up the city or cleaning up it comes a lot in context to displaced people in general. But then the heart of city, I was fascinated. Athens has such a strong anarchist tradition where people just do things they need for themselves and their communities. And so squatting is a strong practice in the city. At the time when I arrived, a lot of the squats, because the right-wing government had just won elections, and a lot of the squats were getting evicted. But on the screen is the Prosperica, which is a 15-year squat, I think, at this point. It's very politicized, very political, and they increasingly more and more displaced people across the border are part of it. And when I was there was this Ethiopian family that was leaving the squad, and it was like a goodbye, and they were like, oh, we will never find people, and the people we found here, because it was a moment of respite where people could access the city, live in the city, in a community, until they want to move elsewhere if they want. And so, in Athens, the struggle was the struggle to the right, to the center of the city. It was the struggle of the right to the city for displaced migrants, because the border is spatial. People are outside, and then when you come inside, you're informalized, illegalized, all of that. So the divide is so clear in the space. And so the squads give like an answer to that, of the right to the city, the right to the city center, allowing people to exist within the urban space, and that articulates a lot of the struggle. In Berlin, it's different. In Berlin, there's a housing crisis, of course, everywhere, and there are all of these typologies of refugee housing, And in Berlin, it's the opposite in the sense that people come, they're accommodated in asylum accommodations, and then when it comes time for them to leave because they are accepted, they can't because the city doesn't, the housing market doesn't allow them to. But unlike Brussels, they don't kick them out. So people end up living in asylum accommodation for years, like long periods of time, which are all substandard and not really qualified as social housing. And so there we looked at this small plot of land here that the government looked at, and they were like, we'll build an asylum accommodation here, but on the ground there were actually some like artisan groups and a house, caravans, they're living, so people who live non-normative forms of housing, and they were assumed to not be there to make way for this, which started a whole process to create a design that combines the two of them here. But then in the end, this is the thing that won. Let's create a border between asylum accommodation and other forms of non-formative housing. And so I think what we took from there is that when we study bordering and urban speculation together, so like the camp and the stadium, the artisan groups and the asylum accommodation, we embed the housing of displaced people within the housing question of the city itself. And that they find themselves often in the marginalized, shrinking of affordable spaces in the city. That's where they find each other, and that there are possibilities for solidarity. That was it.
Are there any questions or comments if you've been also to any of these cities?
One small thing, again, just like Athens, that in the city it's, well, in specific neighborhoods, I not to over-romanticize them, but this kind of demigrantizing work that you're trying to highlight in specific neighborhoods of the city, it's very, very evident that the struggle is not like struggles for migrants, it's struggles that we can just exist in the city. Whoever is there, is it an Athenian? Well, no one is Athenian in general, but whoever is there just has the right to exist. And in the spots and in the occupations, it's difficult, for me it's difficult to not romanticize it. Although the living conditions are extremely dire, the solidarity system and the way that people have made this kind of life their lifestyle, it's extremely admirable. It's something that you cannot get past. People pause their lives for years in order to help and in order to establish their presence and their right to the city center. So it's
Yeah.
Okay, well, if there are no last questions, I really do hope that as some of you, I don't know, continue, I know this is the end, or soon coming to the end of the academic year. Some of you are leaving, but some of you are still going to continue being here for one more year. And I hope that through a lecture like this, and I'm sure you've also seen other Belgium-based lectures, that you're able to see and understand and connect with the cities here differently, but also as a way to reflect on your own context. And maybe to end, I have a question for Tasneem on perhaps on a research level, also knowing that a lot of you are working on your theses as well, and that you're towards the concluding this journey of yours. And I know that it's been quite a personal one. You came to Belgium very new. You've done research on displacement in Sudan, and I think it would be nice to perhaps, if you could offer us kind of your reflections on your process of how you got here, to understanding displacement again, as what Hassan was saying, that it's not just the movement of the body, but situating it within broader things. And for example, you've introduced this notion of bordering practices, but then also zooming into the scale. So how was this research trajectory for you?
Are you asking me to connect it to my previous work
You could either offer really kind of what it meant for you to be doing this type of research, like here within this context, or you could connect it to your previous research as you wish.
Yeah. So from what I understand, some of you already have begun your master's thesis. Is that correct? Or some of you are also beginning to approaching that moment in your trajectories. Okay. I think for me, this PhD was very much a continuation of my master's thesis, actually, even though it's completely different. I wrote my master's thesis as on internal displacement in Khartoum, which is the capital of Sudan, and trying to understand what does it mean when people move from a marginalized region to the capital city where like the powers that marginalize them exist. And then now I'm doing this and I'm realizing I'm kind of doing the same. What does it mean for people from, it's just there's a border in the middle of the movement, that's the only difference. But what does it mean when people from regions that have been maybe exploited or victimized by a certain core move towards it and they become, in Deleuze's words, within the enemy's field of vision, right? And if I have any reflection that may be helpful to you as you do your master's thesis, is to choose something that you're really curious about, like ask questions that you actually want to try to answer, and because for me, like, it was very embedded in my own trajectory, my family history, and all of these things, and it was suddenly a moment where I could actually sit down and try to answer questions that I didn't necessarily really sit with for a long time. I grew up in Khartoum, but my family is from Darfur, and so the connection between the two regions was always obscured in my head. And then when just to be given the opportunity to, through a lens of the concepts and ideas of our field, there are so many questions that can be answered because space is entangled in everything. So find something that you find very curious, which I think it's what I did. And then being here as a migrant first in Belgium, then witnessing my country go through war, and then concluding this trajectory now, I would say use your own personal experiences. Don't claim to be neutral, don't claim to be an objective researcher. I don't think that's very useful. What's useful is to recognize your subjectivity and to describe it in the work itself, and to be very clear about your biases within the work itself. So like, I am for this political project, or I am for this point of view, or I am for this. And that allows you to sometimes engage more directly with topics, but trying to be too neutral, or to not mobilize your own experiences and your own worldview. I think you lose something, and a lot of feminist research tells us that positionality is very important, the experience subjectivity is reflexivity is very important, and so give that space within your work, and don't shy away from what your hunch tells you is right. You can find supporting arguments, but don't shy away from it. Yeah.